Will he eventually be a political prisoner?
Well, I find it kind of odd that he's calling himself a political prisoner when he goes back to his luxury apartment on Fifth Avenue. I don't think most political prisoners have that kind of life. No, he is not a political prisoner. When he says that the system is rigged, the American justice system is rigged in favor of the defendant. He availed himself of the Fifth Amendment right to due process, the Sixth Amendment right to counsel. He could afford his defense. And after that, the system is only rigged because it's rigged to make sure guilty people get convicted. So his claims about that are just political hyperbole. He got a fair trial with an excellent judge. And his trouble was he just had a very good prosecutor, and his defense was very ill-structured and very poorly executed.
So if you think his defense was ill-structured and poorly executed, how much of that is his defense attorney's fault? And if you were Donald Trump looking to the appellate process, would you be looking for new representation?
Well, Donald Trump may look for new representation because he likes to blame other people. I cannot believe that his lawyers, who have reputations of being effective lawyers, would have done all the things that they did if Donald Trump had not insisted on it. Their decisions in the case, I'll give you just one example. Their decision to put on Robert Costello at the very end was absolutely absurd. He added nothing to Trump's defense, in fact, hurt the defense, but that's what Trump wanted. He wanted a contentious kind of witness to go in, and he got slapped down appropriately so by the judge. His defense would have been much better ending just on the cross-examination of Michael Cohen and claiming that he's a perjurer, rather than put on Costello, which added nothing other than make the jury think that he had a weak, anemic defense. And that's just one example.
Well, with hindsight 2020, then, Robert, what should Donald Trump's legal team have done differently, or was there nothing to do to beat these charges?
Well, under the changes in the law, an opinion from the Supreme Court by the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg, his lawyers had to follow what he said. Did Donald Trump, would he do anything differently? I'm not sure he would, because I think Donald Trump was far more concerned with what is going on outside the courtroom than what went on inside the courtroom. Because he's primed to make this big claim that he's a political prisoner and how it was rigged and all these complaints, which he was doing every day. I don't think he particularly cared about his defense in the courtroom, which he evidenced by sitting there with his eyes closed the entire time, communicating to the jury that he didn't think their time was all that important. That's a very bad move, because jurors make you pay for it.
Well, and certainly we saw that all 12 members of the jury ultimately found him guilty of all 34 counts. There was no hung jury, which many suspected could happen, or on at least some of them. But these were only 34 counts of the 88 crimes that Donald Trump has been charged with at the federal and state level, all of them felonies. This one has come to conclusion, barring the appeal, obviously. The others, we have maintained for some time now the expectation they won't go to trial before November. A lot of that may depend on the Supreme Court, Robert. Is your expectation changed at all on that?
No, unfortunately, I think they will be delayed. But you should put this particular verdict in context. All 34 counts, the jurors didn't have any doubts on any of them. And this particular case was widely viewed, and I believe is, the weakest of all the cases against Mr. Trump. So the fact that he went down on 34 counts on the weakest case against him, the most complicated case, the hardest for the jury to understand and accept, really does not bode well for his future prospects on these future cases. So his game has been to delay, 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 and that's what he is trying to win on. I think he will win at that, barring some changes, which could happen. I'm not sure if the 11th Circuit is going to continue to kind of support Judge Eileen Cannon and the things she's doing in the Florida case. And maybe the Georgia case will get its act together and move forward. But barring that, he's probably going to get the delay he desires, because he thinks that if he becomes president of the United States, it confers an immunity on him that no other citizen is allowed to have. And that's just not what America is about, or the criminal justice system is about.
Robert, our team inside the courthouse is letting us know that jurors were seen being taken out the courthouse's back door. They were whisked away in unmarked vehicles, presumably to make their way home. Should they have been afforded additional security, knowing the unprecedented circumstances that we're in here?
Well, they may have been afforded that. We don't know what they were told. I would imagine that the courthouse has offered them security if they get any calls or any other problems that they are to immediately call. Yep. But don't forget, Donald Trump in his public statements can be fickle. He will stop complaining about them very quickly and continue to complain that somehow Joe Biden is behind this. And so I think that they can hope that within a couple of days they will be forgotten from the people that would want to do them harm for doing their duty here. So I think that they can be okay. At least I very much hope so. They were basic American citizens who do their job. You know, we as citizens only have kind of two obligations for all the benefits we receive in America. One is jury duty. The other is we have an obligation to vote, and we do have to pay taxes. But other than that, we get a lot from America, and that's all we got to do.
Well, Robert, of course, for the safety of the jurors, they were included in the gag order that Judge Merchan placed Donald Trump under. He couldn't be making disparaging statements about them or potential witnesses like Michael Cohen. Do they still get that same protection now that the trial is over? Or is he free to talk about these individuals however he wishes without having to be held in contempt of court?
Well, I see no reason why the gag order would end. Although the verdict is in, the case is not over. He has not been sentenced yet. And his attorneys, for instance, are making motions for new trial and all these kind of different tactics they're trying to do now. So I think they should still get kind of the protection and consideration that they deserve, because technically the case isn't over until the judgment is pronounced and then it's certified for appeal.